I didn't always admire Pope Francis. That's how it started. A royal guard, still in full ceremonial uniform, stood before a crowd mourning the Pope's death and said that. People were stunned. Some looked away. Others whispered, "Did he just say what I think he said?" And then he said something else. "I came here tonight to tell the truth." You could have cut the tension with a sword. If a decorated royal guard was about to expose something about the Pope, people were ready for fireworks, scandal, maybe even outrage. And what he followed with was beyond everyone's expectations. So what was this shocking truth? Before we reveal it, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's get into it. The night air had that particular London chill to it. Not the biting cold of winter, but that damp, bone-deep coolness that seeps through wool and leather alike. Just beyond the grand stone arch of Westminster Cathedral, where shadows pooled in ancient corners, a small gathering had formed without announcement or permission. No loudspeakers, no official notice, just people drawn together by shared loss, the recent death of Pope Francis pulling them toward this holy ground like a gentle tide. Candles flickered against the darkness, hundreds of small flames dancing in the gentle breeze, turning the cathedral steps into a constellation of earthbound stars. A simple folding table held a framed photograph of Francis, not formal, not ceremonial, just the Pope sitting beside a child, both of them smiling as if sharing a secret joke. Next to it, someone had placed a handwritten sign in careful block letters, "A shepherd, not a king." Hymns rose and fell in gentle waves. The mourners, some in clerical collars, others in hospital scrubs or business attire, formed a patchwork of London's soul. This wasn't a state function. This wasn't planned. Just grief, finding its voice in the spaces between cathedral stones. That's when he appeared. Lance Corporal Edward Statham hadn't meant to stop. You could see it in the measured cadence of his boots against pavement. He was heading somewhere else, mind occupied with duty rosters and inspection schedules. Late shift at Wellington Barracks, perhaps. The scarlet tunic of the Royal Guard caught street light like a wound in the darkness. His black bearskin cap was tucked respectfully under one arm. Standard protocol when off ceremonial duty, but still in uniform. Something made him stop. Maybe the candles. Maybe the singing. Maybe something deeper he couldn't have named if asked. A priest near the edge of the gathering noticed him first. An older man with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades offering communion. "Evening, sir," the priest said quietly, approaching with cautious respect. "You're welcome to join us, if you'd like." Edward nodded once, not quite military, not quite civilian. "Thank you, Father." For several minutes he simply stood to one side, observing. His posture remained parade ground perfect, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, gaze direct. But his eyes, there was something in them. Something that didn't quite match the starched perfection of his uniform. Later, the nun would tell others it was her idea. She'd whispered to the priest, who'd nodded before approaching Edward again. "We're inviting those who wish to say a few words," the priest explained, his voice soft but clear, "if you feel moved to do so." The guard hesitated, just for a moment. Just long enough for anyone watching to notice the internal battle. Duty against impulse, protocol against something more human. Then he moved. His boots against stone created a rhythm that didn't belong to ceremony or parade. It belonged to decision, to choice. He walked to the front, past the table with its flickering candles, and turned to face the gathering. The crowd shifted. Whispers rose, then fell away. A royal guard in full dress uniform wasn't something you saw speaking in public, let alone at an informal vigil for the head of a different faith altogether. Edward stood perfectly still for a moment, gathering himself. Then, in a voice that carried without seeming to try, "My name is Lance Corporal Edward Statham, Royal Guard, posted at Wellington Barracks. I didn't plan to speak tonight. I was just passing by, coming off duty, and when I saw your candles, I couldn't just walk past." The crowd stilled. Even the children stopped fidgeting. "If you'll permit me," he continued, "I'd like to share something I've never told anyone, something that's been weighing on me since I heard the news." You could have heard a feather fall in that silence. Edward looked down at his gloved hands, then back up, his gaze steady now. "But before I say what I've come to say, I need to be honest with all of you. I didn't always admire Pope Francis." The words landed like stones in still water. Several people exchanged glances. A few shifted uncomfortably. One woman near the front looked as if she might stand up and leave. The guard didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, though something in his eyes had softened. "I know that might sound terrible, especially here, especially now, but if I'm going to speak tonight, I want to do it honestly, not from some rehearsed script, not from someone else's words." His hands, perfectly steady when aiming a rifle or standing at attention for hours, showed the slightest tremor as he clasped them behind his back. When I first heard of him, I didn't trust it, any of it. The headlines about the shoes, the apartment he refused to move into, the humility. His lips quirked in a tired half smile. "Where I come from, in my world, we judge men not by what they say, but by how they stand, how they carry themselves, what they do when no one's looking." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the gathering. And I thought he was too soft, too gentle to be taken seriously, too forgiving to lead, too simple to command the kind of respect his position demanded. Someone coughed. A priest shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but no one interrupted. I remember seeing some tabloid headline once. Something about him refusing a bulletproof car, about how he still wore those same black shoes he'd had forever. And I remember saying to one of my mates, "That man won't last a year. He doesn't understand how the game is played." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, mostly from younger faces who recognized that peculiar British cynicism. "But here's what I didn't understand then," Edward continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. "He wasn't playing the game, and that was precisely the point." The tension in the gathering eased slightly. This wasn't going to be scandal. This was confession. I started noticing things, not the headlines, not the photo ops, but the gaps between them. The things that never made the evening news. Prison visits, letters to strangers, phone calls to families who'd lost someone. He let the words settle like dust motes in cathedral light. I'd spent my whole career believing dignity came from uniform, from posture, from protocol. He gestured subtly to his scarlet tunic. But Francis, he showed me that real dignity comes from presence, from showing up when no one expects you to, from taking off the crown and walking beside the people who need you most. His voice softened further, and I realized I was wrong about him, about what power really looks like, about what actually matters. The night seemed to draw in closer around them all. Not threatening, more like a blanket being pulled tighter for comfort. I didn't come here planning to speak, but I've carried this too long. For just a moment, his eyes glistened in the candlelight. So if you're still with me, I'll tell you what changed. It was a few years back, Edward began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man retrieving a memory long stored away. I was on leave, nothing fancy, just a long weekend in Rome with a mate from the Paris. Typical soldier's holiday. Vatican tour, good coffee, bit of wandering, nothing spiritual, nothing serious. The crowd settled into listening now. This wasn't a eulogy anymore. It was a story. Around that time, there was a notice posted. Pope Francis was offering a short private audience, just a few minutes, open to European servicemen stationed abroad. The chaplain back home had put my name down without asking me, thinking it might expand my horizons. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I nearly didn't go. Knowing chuckles rippled through the crowd. But I did, mostly out of duty. I didn't bring a gift, didn't prepare anything to say. I figured I'd be standing in the back anyway. Just another uniform in a sea of them. He looked up, the candlelight caught in his eyes. I'll never forget the first moment I saw him in person. Not on a balcony or behind some golden throne, just walking into the room. No fanfare, no entourage, just a man in plain white robes and those famously worn-out shoes. Edward's voice softened. He stopped to speak to the cleaning woman on his way in, not just a nod, an actual conversation. Someone near the front made the sign of the cross, almost involuntarily. I stood there stiff as a poker, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. Bow, salute, kneel? Before I could decide, he solved the problem for me. He nodded at me first. The crowd leaned forward slightly, pulled by the authenticity in his voice. He didn't deliver some prepared speech, no formal blessing. He just talked. Said he knew many of us carried things the church couldn't absolve. That war leaves more behind than it takes. That sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is forgive himself. Edward paused, his gaze distant, and then he said something I've never forgotten. The air stilled, as if London itself were holding its breath. Some battles we fight with weapons, Edward quoted softly. Others we win by simply standing still, by holding ground with love. He looked around, letting the words land. I can't explain exactly what happened. I didn't cry. I didn't drop to my knees. I didn't feel some dramatic conversion, but something shifted. Not with thunder, just with truth. He took a small step closer to the photograph on the vigil table. I was raised on discipline, trained in order. I still value these things, but for the first time, I met someone who carried more authority by kneeling than most men do, by standing on pedestals. His voice almost faltered, but he caught himself. I shook his hand that day. Didn't say much. Couldn't find the words. But as he moved to the next soldier, he turned back to me and said, "Don't forget, real strength is often mistaken for weakness. Let them make that mistake." Edward swallowed hard, the motion visible despite his perfect posture. I've worn this red coat for nearly a decade now. Stood still for hours in the rain and snow, been photographed by tourists, mocked by drunks, but that single encounter made me understand what I'd been missing. He looked around the gathering, faces soft now in the gentle light. I came home from that trip different, not dramatically, not visibly, just shifted, but I didn't tell anyone. Not my fellow guards, not my commanding officer, not even my family. A thin smile crossed his face. I suppose I was afraid they'd say I'd gone soft. The smile faded, replaced by something more resolute. But I hadn't. I just discovered a different kind of strength, and I wasn't ready to admit that. Until tonight. I tried to forget it, Edward continued, his voice stronger now but more vulnerable somehow. That meeting, that sentence, that moment. I came back to barracks and fell into the rhythm of duty, polish, parade, perfect posture. The world doesn't pause just because you've had your foundation shaken, especially not when you wear a uniform. The crowd was captivated now. The early skepticism had vanished. This wasn't performance. It was truth, unvarnished and rare. But a few months later, almost accidentally, I got involved with a veterans outreach program. Nothing official, just something I helped with after hours. Thursday evenings in a drafty church hall near Victoria Station, we'd host a dozen or so ex-servicemen each week. Some were sleeping rough. Others were fighting demons you couldn't see. None of them felt like they mattered anymore. His gaze flickered briefly to the elderly nun standing near the front. One gentleman named Reggie, Royal Navy, served in the Falklands. He used to mutter to himself every few minutes, "What's the bloody point? Like a mantra or a prayer?" Soft laughter, the kind that comes from recognizing truth, moved through the gathering. We didn't offer much: hot tea, some sandwiches, chairs that didn't wobble too badly, but mostly we listened. That was the currency: presence. Edward's voice changed subtly, a note of wonder entering it. Then one day, Father Thomas, the parish priest, called me into his office with the strangest expression I'd ever seen. I thought I'd stepped on someone's toes. Instead, he handed me an envelope, white, official stamp from Vatican City. The crowd stirred again, a collective intake of breath. I thought it must be a mistake, but the seal was genuine. And inside, he paused, was a letter, not printed, not a form, handwritten, in careful, slightly slanted script from Pope Francis himself. Several gasped now. A woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand. He'd somehow heard about our little gathering. Said someone, a visiting priest, perhaps had mentioned it to him. And he'd taken the time to write. Not a formal blessing, not a press statement. With reverent care, Edward reached into his tunic pocket and removed a folded, laminated sheet of paper. "I keep a copy with me," he said quietly. "I hope you'll forgive me reading just a little of it." No one objected. No one even breathed. Carefully unfolding it, he began, "To the men and women who fought under no cathedral, who bled into soil far from home, and now gather not for glory, but for healing. I see you. I remember you. I bless you. You are not forgotten, neither by God nor by me." The silence that followed was profound, thick with emotion and understanding. He included a small donation, probably from his personal funds. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the recognition, the dignity. Edward's voice warmed with memory. That next week, Reggie stopped saying, "What's the point?" He started asking, "Did you read what the Holy Father wrote to us?" Gentle laughter, the kind tinged with tears, rose from several corners. And that's when I truly understood. Francis didn't need to intimidate to be powerful. He didn't need armies or palaces or grand gestures. He just needed to notice people. With careful movements, Edward folded the letter and placed it gently on the vigil table beside the framed photograph. Since that day, I've stopped measuring strength by volume or status or medals. He looked out across the candlelit faces. I've stood guard beside royalty, but that letter, that came from a servant, and it moved mountains no royal decree ever could. He shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, just settling. That's when I stopped reading headlines and started watching his heart. "I didn't know he was dying," Edward said, his voice quieter now, but somehow reaching every corner of the gathering. "None of us really did. Not until it was already happening." The candlelight wavered in the evening breeze, casting living shadows across his scarlet tunic. The crowd had grown utterly still. They said he was ill, slowing down. There were rumors he might step down, but that wasn't his way, was it? Francis wasn't one for grand exits. He just kept going, visiting the forgotten, speaking to the rejected, blessing those no one else would touch. He paused, the phrase catching in his throat like a splinter. And when the announcement finally came, when the Vatican confirmed he'd passed, I was sitting in the barracks break room with a half-finished cup of tea. Someone had left the television on, live feed from St. Peter's Square. The bells were tolling their terrible news. His gaze lowered to the stone beneath his polished boots. In my line of work, we have protocols for everything, especially death. You stand straight, you remain silent, you honor without spectacle, and that's exactly what I did. Right there in that empty room, I stood up, walked to the middle of the floor, and saluted the screen. No audience, no ceremony, just respect. A woman near the front wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Others bowed their heads as if reliving that moment with him. I can't explain why I did it. In 15 years of service, I've guarded kings, prime ministers, foreign dignitaries. I've saluted generals who couldn't remember my name if their lives depended on it. But that man on the television, the one in the simple wooden coffin, he earned every inch of that salute. The wind shifted, sending candle flames dancing in silent tribute. I read afterwards that even as Pope, he refused to move into the papal apartments, chose to live in a simple guesthouse room until the very end, that he declined experimental treatments, saying simply, if the Lord is calling, who am I to ask him to wait? A gentle, almost disbelieving smile crossed Edward's face. In my world, we talk constantly about duty to crown, to country, to regiment, but Francis, he understood a different duty, one without ribbons or medals, one that didn't care about cameras or acclaim. His eyes found the photograph on the table again. And yet somehow, he became the most influential man I barely knew. The gathered mourners were perfectly still now. Even the distant London traffic seemed to have hushed. So I made myself a promise that night, Edward continued. If there was a vigil anywhere near me, official or not, planned or spontaneous, I would be there. Not because I'm Catholic, not because I'm in uniform. He drew a slow, measured breath, but because I needed to stand at attention one final time. For a man who never stood still unless it was beside someone who was broken. Edward Statham took a single step forward, not from pride, but from necessity, as if the weight of truth he carried demanded its own space. When I first began speaking tonight, he said, his voice remarkably steady, I told you I wanted to be honest, that I hadn't always admired Pope Francis, that something had been weighing on me that I needed to share, and I saw it in your eyes. Some of you were expecting a revelation, a scandal, the shocking truth that always seems to follow powerful men. The silence was complete now. Well, here it is. He scanned the faces before him, open now, expectant, but not with cynicism, with hope. The shocking truth is this: he was exactly who he claimed to be. Several people gasped softly, not from disappointment, but from recognition. No smoke and mirrors, no hidden agenda, no PR team crafting his image. The man who spoke of mercy actually lived it. The Pope who washed prisoners' feet kept doing it long after the cameras lost interest. The Cardinal who wore the same shoes for a decade never traded them for something more befitting his station. A woman near the center pressed her hands against her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. Someone whispered, Amen, so quietly it might have been just a breath. We exist in an age, Edward said, where power announces itself with noise, where leaders tweet their thoughts before they've finished having them, where apologies are calculated and vulnerability is seen as fatal weakness. But this man, this Pope, chose quiet over spectacle, service over status, truth, gentle, inconvenient, beautiful truth, over reputation. With slow, deliberate movements, he removed his white gloves, one finger at a time, not as a statement, but as an offering of authenticity. And I realized that I'd spent my career perfecting buttons and creases, standing still for hours being seen but never heard. I thought that was enough. He shook his head, slightly. But Francis taught me otherwise. He laid the gloves carefully on the table beside the letter and the photograph. He showed me that silence isn't just discipline. It can be devotion. That standing still isn't just following orders. It can mean choosing not to strike back. That humility isn't weakness. It's strength wrapped in grace. Edward drew himself to his full height, not rigid, not performative, but dignified. We salute heads of state. We kneel at tombs of warriors. We honor those who conquered. His hand rose in a perfect salute, not to the photo, but to the people gathered in the darkness. Tonight we remember a shepherd. Tears fell freely now from the clergy, from the strangers, from a young man in a football jersey, holding a candle as if it were something precious. Edward lowered his arm with military precision. That's the truth I needed to share, not scandal, not secrets, just this simple fact that our world keeps forgetting. That greatness can wear scuffed shoes, that true power needs no throne, and that sometimes the holiest person in any room is the one who speaks least and listens most. The night air carried the mingled scents of candle wax and incense. In the distance, church bells marked the hour. "But you don't need to take my word for it," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "Read what he wrote. Remember how he made you feel when you saw him. Think about why you're standing here tonight." He stepped back slowly. The crowd didn't applaud. That would have broken the spell. They simply stood, something sacred having passed between them, until one person began to clap, then another and another. Edward bowed his head slightly, a gesture of quiet humility, and stepped aside. For a long moment, no one spoke. The applause had died as quickly as it had risen, like summer rain that starts and stops without warning. All that remained was the gentle flutter of candle flames and the distant hum of London continuing beyond their small circle of light. Edward moved away from the center, his white gloves still resting on the table. He didn't look back at the photo or the gathering. He simply stood among them now, not separate, not elevated, just a man who had said what needed saying. A small voice broke the reverent quiet. Was he really that kind? Heads turned. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, with blonde fringe and an oversized coat, stood holding her mother's hand near the edge of the gathering. Her eyes held the kind of pure curiosity adults forget how to carry. Edward knelt down, not with military stiffness, but with gentle attention, eye to eye with the child. "Kinder than any of us deserved," he said softly. The girl nodded, considering this answer with serious eyes. Then she stepped forward and placed a small plastic flower near the frame. It was slightly bent, clearly well loved, but somehow it belonged there perfectly. As Edward rose again, others began to move forward. A nurse set down a rosary. A gray-haired man left a small medal. 2 guards in civilian clothes, obviously off-duty, nodded respectfully to Edward before joining the vigil in silence. What had begun as a simple memorial had transformed into something harder to name, something more honest, more human. Edward watched for a moment longer, not looking at the items being placed on the table, but at the faces of those leaving them, people carrying something now that they hadn't arrived with. Then, without ceremony, he turned and walked down the cathedral steps. His posture remained faultless, his pace measured, every inch the royal guard he had always been. But something fundamental had shifted, not in how he walked, but in what he no longer carried alone. Would you have had the courage to speak like Edward did? To admit you were wrong about someone you'd misjudged? Do you believe that true strength sometimes comes disguised as gentleness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Do us a small favor. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon, and make sure you never miss one of our daily uploads. And if you know someone who might need a reminder about what quiet power really looks like in a world obsessed with noise, share this video with them. It might matter more than you know. Our other Royal Guard stories are appearing on your screen now. Go ahead and choose one to watch next, and I'll be back tomorrow, same time, with another unforgettable tale.